and so they started to investigate all the associations and people that she knew. They were taking a lot of blood samples and saliva swabs and what have you for people, testing DNA against the DNA they had in the apartment. They were convinced at one juncture that it was a fellow student that had killed her. And the investigation drug on and on and on through the summer of 1998 into the fall. There was quite a ruckus in Philadelphia about the police having been at her door and not taking the door down. But there was not much anybody could do. They kept looking. They were intensely looking. They found two other cases in the police records that they were convinced, when they started to look into the details, they were convinced were linked to this series of cases. They had also happened in the months just before Shannon was attacked. But in those two cases, when the victims had complained to the police, filed complaints with the police had classified their cases as non-crimes. They had said there's no evidence here that a crime was really committed. Front page story. The next day, the chief of police holds a press conference, and lo and behold, they had linked DNA in her case to the other cases. The next day, they broke the sixth case, and again the next day, the police chief had a press conference and linked these cases. Had they admitted these cases before Shannon was attacked, they would have had 4 cases. They would have been notifying the community, but they had not notified the community. So there was this major scandal, and the city council got involved, and they forced the police chief to go back and do an audit on cases that were classified as non-crimes that were reported sexual assaults. They went back 5 years, the statute of limitations, and they reopened 2,000 cases of reported sexual assaults or rapes that had been classified as non-crimes. Based on evidence they had in their files, they reclassified more than 1,200 of them, more than 60% of them, as felony assaults. So there was a major, major scandal. Now, they didn't ultimately identify this guy through all of the trickery that you see on the television shows. What they did is they matched credit records. They cross-checked credit records. Somebody that was doing credit purchases in the Philadelphia area in the 97, 98, 99 period with anybody that was making credit purchases out in the Colorado area in the 2001, 2002 period. And they came down with a very short list. They brought him in that evening, and within 2 or 3 hours, he confessed to all of these crimes.
That's so much evidence.
By the time he was apprehended, Vicki and I were out very publicly on the public record that we were opposed to the death penalty, that we would not support the death penalty in the apprehension and prosecution of Shannon's murder. Despite that, and despite the fact that of the 14 known attacks, there was only one murder, only case where the police were called during the attack, the police were standing outside the door of the attack when it was occurring, that was the only murder. Despite our very public position, the prosecuting attorney in Philadelphia went out the next day, been apprehended out in Colorado, mind you. The prosecuting attorney went out in Philadelphia the next day, and she said she didn't care what the Schiebers thought or believed, that the appropriate penalty in this case was the death penalty, and that's what they were going to seek. And we had a very messy exchange in the press, and there was a op-ed writer in the Daily News that sent kind of a, well, it was an open letter saying that we had no right to take this position. And the Daily News allowed us to respond. But finally, the prosecutor, the DA, recanted, and they negotiated a settlement, a plea settlement, with the assailant. He agreed that he would plead guilty to all of the assaults in Philadelphia in trade for being sentenced to life in prison without parole in Shannon's murder. because of the position we took. He was apprehended on the 23rd day of April. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for Shannon's murder on the 31st day of May. And he was also sentenced to an additional 250 years for the other attacks. And he was to serve these sequentially. He was then remanded to Colorado. He was sentenced there at the end of July, and he got another life in prison without parole because in one of those cases out there, he picked the victim up and moved her from one room to another, and that allowed them to classify it as a kidnapping, and kidnapping can carry life in prison without parole. So he got another life in prison without parole, plus an additional 200 or 300 years. All of these serve to be served sequentially. He will never be out walking the face of the earth again. We didn't want that to happen because these kinds of people, from everything we have been told by all kinds of people, is that if he's turned loose, he will begin to attack again. Despite the position we took, despite the haste with which this was all handled, mind you, in the typical death penalty case, the sentence is not typically carried out until 17 years after the crime. Mind you, in our case, it was about 5 weeks. Despite all of this, despite all the money that we saved the city of Philadelphia, the state of Pennsylvania, the prosecuting attorney went out the afternoon after he was sentenced in Philadelphia and held another press conference. Said she still didn't care what the Schiebers thought, what they believed. That the appropriate penalty in this case was the death penalty. Now think about it. This was all carried in the press. Oh, got a lot of coverage. Think about the next family that came into this situation. And the prosecutors come to them and they say, you know, the appropriate penalty here for your benefit, for your child's benefit, your spouse's benefit, your loved one's benefit, is that we pursue the death penalty. And think about how their willingness probably was, in some cases at least, was thwarted by the very public spectacle, the very public fight that we were put through. You know, she had the audacity to say that this was about fighting crime. Despite that,